Great light, my loves, and the love of the living Father. Testament was written in the Hebrew script. Hebrew was the language of the Jewish people before Jesus and at the time of Jesus. The Old Testament was written in the Hebrew script. Hebrew was the language of the Jewish people before Jesus and at the time of Jesus. The Old Testament was written in the Hebrew script. Hebrew was the language of the Jewish people before Jesus and at the time of Jesus. I can prove that through the Bible. In the book of Acts, read about the Apostle Paul. A riot started around him in Jerusalem, and he was arrested by Roman soldiers. Paul spoke to the commander of the Roman force in Greek. Greek was the everyday language of that part of the world and had been from the time of Alexander the Great. About 300 years before Jesus, Alexander the Great conquered all the known world and brought in Greek culture and the Greek language, which is the reason why we have the New Testament delivered to us in Greek. Back to the book of Acts. Paul asked the commander for permission to speak to the Jewish crowd. Paul spoke to the Jewish crowd in Hebrew. The Greek word in the New Testament is evridi, which can only be translated as Hebrew. Hebrew was the language of the Jews, not Aramaic. What happened to the language of Hebrew from then until now? About 20 years after the events of Acts chapter 21, the Jewish people staged a revolt against the Romans, and the Romans put the revolt down and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. About 60 years after that date, the Jewish people staged a second revolt against the Romans, and this time they were crushed. The remnant, those who survived, were thrust out of the land and scattered all over the known world. Wherever they went, they settled in the lands and they learned the language. And Hebrew became simply a liturgical language for religious purposes. It remained that way for 17 or 1800 years. But in the late 1800s, Jews in Eastern Europe started to move back to the land of Israel, to what had been renamed Palestine. Among their number was a man, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who became a leader of the movement behind the revival of the Hebrew language as a language of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Hebrew moved from being a liturgical language to an everyday language, and today it's spoken by more than 6 million people in Israel. It is the only example in history of a sacred language becoming a national language. It's a miracle, and I see the hand of God in it. Here on the screen is a chart of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Hebrew is read from right to left. The first letter is an aleph, and the last letter is a tav. In English, we'd say from A to Z. In Greek, they'd say from alpha to omega. But in Hebrew, they say from aleph to tav. Note that Hebrew has no lowercase letters. They don't have capital letters and then smaller letters as we do in English. All letters are capitals. Also, all letters are consonants. There are no vowel letters in the Hebrew language. About 500 years after Jesus, Jewish scribes, the Masoretic scribes in the city of Tiberias in the Galilee, came together to decide on a system of vowel pointing so that the pronunciation of words could be preserved for liturgical purposes. What are called nikud, or plural nikudot, vowel points, were developed. They indicate vowel sounds and alternative pronunciation of certain letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Here on the screen is an example from a page of the Torah. If you were to buy a modern Hebrew reader, this is what it would look like. It's the sort of reading they do in the synagogues. They read from scrolls or from books with this type of nikudot pointing. But the dot points were not in the original text. They were not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which can be firmly dated to about 100 years before Jesus. They were not in the original scrolls. Also, they are not in modern Hebrew books or newspapers. But they are useful to us so that we know what is the accurate pronunciation of those words. Now, look at this line of Hebrew letters. It's interesting when you look at it that a couple of letters at least stand out because they are outside the norm. The first I'd note is the Yud. It's the smallest letter, the 10th letter. We might say it is suspended in the air. It doesn't touch the lower line and it doesn't reach above it. It's a tiny letter. The 12th letter in this line is a Lamed. It is the only letter that reaches above the line, reaching up, we might say. There are 22 Hebrew letters. That's an interesting number because there are 66 books in the Bible. 66 is 3 times 22. Isaiah is probably the most important of the Old Testament prophets. The book of Isaiah is divided into 66 chapters, 3 times 22. The last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, is divided into 22 chapters. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible. It has 176 verses, which is 8 times 22. And there's a simple reason for that, because Psalm 119 is an acrostic. Every 8 verses starts with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The first 8 verses, the first word of each verse starts with an aleph. The next 8 verses, the first word of each verse starts with a bet, and so on. Here are the names of the 22 Hebrew letters. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ein, Pe, Tzadi, Kuf, Resh, Shin, Tav. Now there's another feature of the Hebrew alphabet. 5 of the letters have a final form. In other words, when the letter appears at the end of a word, the shape of the letter changes. On the screen, you'll see that the shape of the letter Kaf changes when it's at the end of a word. The same goes for Mem, Nun, He, and Tzadi, which means that we have 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but in 27 different forms. 2 final points. The first is that the Hebrew word for a letter of the alphabet is an ot, spelled Aleph, Vav, Tav. This is interesting because it is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then Vav in between those 2 letters. That's the spelling of the word ot. Ot in Hebrew means a sign or a mark or a symbol. But it also means a signal from God, a miraculous sign or event. We first find the word in the first chapter of Genesis, where we're told that God placed the sun, moon, and stars in the heavens as signs. In Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, we are told that God placed the rainbow in the sky as a sign, an ot, of the promise, the covenant that he made, that he would never again destroy the earth by flood. We find this in several other places in the Old Testament. One, significantly, would be in Exodus chapter 31, where God told the Jewish people, under the law of Moses that he had instituted, that the Sabbath was to be a sign for Israel. So it's interesting to me that the word for a miraculous sign from God is an ot, and the word for a letter of the Hebrew alphabet is an ot. And it is because each letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a sign from God pointing to the Messiah, pointing to Jesus. And the last thing that I'd say in this seminar session is that if you look at the line of Hebrew letters, including the final forms, all 27 forms, and we take the first letter, an aleph, the middle letter would be Mem. And then the last letter of the alphabet would be Tav. Aleph, Mem, Tav. It spells Emet in Hebrew, which means truth. And Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
Literally. Literally. But I wanted to share that with others. I'm not gonna stay on too long. Just wanted to share that with y'all. We already speaking it. Already. Or where I am, I'm already saying it. Already. I love you all greatly.